Hey, Pete.
Yes.
This is Dan in Southern California. That's 2 days back into teaching. I'm a teacher, and it was interesting. You know, I probably put in a 12-hour day yesterday trying to figure out how to get all my emails, how to contact.
Don't you teach phys ed?
Yeah. So that's going to be it.
You're just sending students instructions on kickball. Come on.
No, unfortunately, it's not quite that simple.
I know, I'm being a jerk. All right, I was just about to start, and you said that, and I'm going to come back to you on that, Dan. Here we go. Hello, everyone. This is Stand Up for Wednesday, April 8th, 2020. Taping today's opening in front of a live audience of my favorite people on Zoom. Several subscribers hanging out with me as I tape this. If you want to join us, go to patreon.com/Pete Dominic. Joining me today to talk about the most pressing issue outside of life and death with the coronavirus, to talk hunger and food insecurity, are Noreen Springstead of Why Hunger and Vallas of the Center for American Progress's Poverty to Prosperity Program. Also, constitutional law professor Eric Segall, the legal eagle, to talk about the insanity of the state of Wisconsin holding their primary during a pandemic. Let's do this, shall we? All right, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me here on Stand Up. I've been opening the show every day, and we are daily now. I'm going daily with the numbers of confirmed cases of COVID-19, deaths, and recoveries. Because, you know, I like to open the show with a positive, upbeat note. Total confirmed cases as 7 p.m. on Tuesday night. Worldwide, this is 1,414,738. Total deaths worldwide, 81,259 souls gone. Total recoveries, 298,642 in the United States. As of 7 p.m. on Tuesday night, 387,547 confirmed cases. Total deaths, 12,291. Total recoveries, 20,395. How many people that are hanging out with me tonight know someone who has been diagnosed or confirmed? And how many of you know somebody who has actually died? All right, I got a lot of hands up. We got about 28 people in there. And almost everybody put your hand up if you know somebody who's in confirmed case. Okay, most people in the room. And has anybody lost anybody yet that you know directly? Nobody's saying anything, so that's a good sign. I'm happy to hear that. Well, thank you all for joining me. There's a ton that I want to get through, but before I start with all of the news, I said before I started recording, that some of the mundane things that are happening in life are super interesting to me right now because it's such a change. And so Dan is out in Southern California. Dan, you were saying this is the first day where you thought people in your community were taking it seriously?
Yeah, in fact, I'm watching two people right now walk their dog up the street, and they both got their masks on. Earlier today, I had to drop some mail off for my mom who lives next door. And when I went out, that's been about 4 days since I've gone out the last time. And I noticed for the first time about 85% of the people were wearing masks, which was nice to see, you know, especially my mom was around someone who actually had it. My first cousin down in Mexico had it. And then when she came back, we got her back early, actually, because of you. And then we quarantined them for about 17 days. We went a few days extra just to be safe. And since then, we've seen them. But you know, getting them back from Mexico right when it was just starting to blow up down there where they were, and they're not taking it seriously down there. I think they're half a step behind. But anyways, it's nice to see right now that around here, at least, you know, people are starting to take it seriously.
Is that dog wearing a mask? You know, you heard about that tiger at the Bronx Zoo that contracted coronavirus? You didn't hear?
Actually, I did hear about that.
Tina, what are you noticing down in Texas?
I had to run to the post office this morning, and they have a screen up to protect all the clerks now. They had the doors all propped open so you don't have to touch the doors to go in and out. And of close to 15 people I saw, I was there, everybody, but one or two people had masks on. So I haven't really been out much. I've been mostly in the house. So it's the first time I really saw a lot of masks. out. I'm in a suburb just south of Austin.
All right. Anybody else have any observations that has gone on in their community? My park near my house just closed, which I was pretty upset about. That is where I pretty much go running or walking every day. Anybody else have anything weird or something they want to mention? Karen, where are you?
I'm in Hagerstown, Maryland. It's just northwest
go ahead.
Washington, D.C. So they've started making us like you have a traffic pattern inside the grocery store. Like aisles are one way. They're counting how many people go in the door and how many people go out. Like they're only allowing like people inside the grocery store at one time. Yeah. Well, I guess Giant, which is one of the big grocery people here, they had somebody die here in the state of COVID-19. So they're like everybody's, all the grocery store workers are wearing masks and gloves.
Yeah, I noticed that at my grocery store as well. All right, let me get to some of this news today. If anybody else has anything they want to chime in on, every one of these observations is interesting, and it's also different from state to state and county or parish or community to community, right? I mean, people are observing this differently in different places. All right, so today's big story outside of obviously the deaths, the numbers, I think has to be that Wisconsin held its primary election in the middle of a pandemic, which I don't know if there's a bigger story than that one, but absolutely insane what has gone on there. Of course, Republicans want to make it as difficult as possible to vote. We understand that. They've been pretty overt and honest about that, guys. But one thing that I suppose like no hypothetical was ever brought up that someone said, well, Republicans are going to make you vote even if you could die. Does anybody think that people won't die? People are going to die that either volunteered to work the polls, many of which are senior citizens, or people that were determined to go vote today because that state wouldn't postpone their primary election, which they could have and they should have. So I don't know. I think that's just a crazy story out of Wisconsin.
This is the mindset. I mean, we are 4.25% of the world's population, but yet we now have like almost 27 or 28% of the world's cases. That's directly because we're doing a shitty job from the top. That guy sucks. It's terrible.
There's a little more background to that, Pete. The governor of Wisconsin is a Democrat.
Tony Evers.
And correct. And the Republican Party sued him after he ordered that the primary be delayed. And of course, the Supreme Court of Wisconsin is loaded up with Republican picks, and they forced the primary to be held today.
Yeah, that is a good background. Thank you, Brock. Crazy story out of Wisconsin. And who are these people that went and voted? I mean, I wouldn't have done that. It's such an important election too. They had the Wisconsin Supreme Court nominees were up for election, so. Crazy. Long lines of voters, according to CNN, many of them wearing face masks, stretched for blocks through Milwaukee early Tuesday as Wisconsin held a primary in the middle of a pandemic.
It's crazy.
Republicans who have insisted on keeping the election on schedule won two legal battles Monday as the state Supreme Court blocked the Democratic governor there. And I had a really fascinating conversation with Eric Segall, one of my all-time favorites. He is not happy about this, and he's really concerned about this. A lot of people writing about what this means for the presidential election as well. All right, let's take a quick break from the news. I just want to be honest with you. I'm always trying to be honest with you, and because I'm a pretty sophisticated, healthy, prepared person, my fridge is filled with both Michelob Ultra and Bud Light, and I'm here to tell you all that Michelob Ultra tastes much better. Does anybody want to weigh in?
I agree. Definitely better.
Thank you, Dan. Anybody else? Michelob Ultra versus Bud Light. You know, I like a low-calorie beer, and I'm a sophisticated drinker. So.
Mexican beers are usually better.
Is that right?
Pick.
It's been also, I should mention, I'm on the Dan Savage podcast as a guest, Savage Lovecast, but apparently the paid version only, the Magnum version. You know what that means, everybody. So that was pretty cool. That was a lot of fun to do. And that posted today. All right, it's been almost a month since many of us began to isolate from others and stay at home as much as we can. And more good news, everybody. After having a heart attack in early October, then suffering a fall and losing vision in his right eye, my dad, who is 75 years old and 8 months, 75 and a half, he rode his bike 20 miles today. So that's very good news. Really excited for my dad. He's not satisfied because he's not riding hills. So that was pretty cool to learn today. I'm really psyched about his comeback. He is not slowing down, the old man. All right. Also, good news out of Detroit. Anybody living in Michigan? Good Samaritan purchased gas for nurses on Wednesday and Thursday at an Exxon Express gas station in Detroit near the hospital there. His name is Alan Marshall. He saved money for something he had his eyes on, but the pandemic changed his mind. He set up shop outside the hospital with a sign that said free gas for nurses and decided to give back to those on front lines. That's cool. Anybody else? I know Tina said before we're taping, you're sewing masks. Anybody else doing anything good or hear about anybody else doing anything good that you want to weigh in on right now to help out those on the front lines or in any other way?
Getting groceries from taking mail from my mom. But that's not too special.
Taking care of your mom, all right, who lives next door, right? What else? Anybody else got anything that they're doing or they heard others are doing?
There's a lot of fundraising on Twitter. I've seen a lot of threads where people have been, like a personal will set it up and say, I've got $3,500 to give $100. And what I'm seeing that's really cool is then people will go into the timeline and people who didn't get money, they'll just pay them directly, like they're asking for their Cash App or their Venmo, or so people will post, I've got 2 kids and my electric bill's due, and I can't waitress, and it's been really kind of cool just to see people step up and help people.
Yeah,
like
I saw
that.
All these comedians are raising money for other comedians who are obviously out of work. And then today, somebody reached out to me from a nonprofit and said, could you get some comedians to do a fundraiser to help, the homeless and people living on the brink? And I was like, I think comedians are going to want to do fundraising for comedians. Like nobody's got any gigs, unless you're really well off, or a wealthy, huge comedian so it's like everybody needs a little help right now. Anybody else notice anything charitable?
Well, didn't the founder of Twitter just give $1 billion?
Oh, that's right. Was it $1 billion?
COVID relief. $1 billion with a B.
Wow. Yeah, Jack Dorsey donates $1 billion to who or to what? I don't know. That's good. That's nice
Maybe
of him.
Maybe it's just a tax deduction. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Also, here's some good news. Rand Paul has recovered from coronavirus. He's now volunteering at the hospital. So he's a doctor. Yeah. Rand Paul.
Well, he's a doctor.
Yeah.
Maybe he'll get a dose of real life.
Good point. Yeah. Acting Navy Secretary Thomas Modly submitted his resignation, or was he fired? Who knows? On Tuesday, after being recorded calling this Navy captain of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the guy who was Crozier, I think his name was, on that aircraft carrier, he called him stupid. And now the Navy secretary has apologized and resigned. What a crazy story that is. What an absolutely insane story. The President of the United States gives a pardon to a war criminal, Gallagher, and fires a hero. How can anybody in the military support Donald Trump?
I think the video of the crew cheering Captain Crowley as he left the ship went viral.
Yeah.
And they were embarrassed, completely embarrassed by what they had done, and had to have an out for it. And so they sacrificed the lamb, as it were.
Yeah, that's probably a good point. And his name is Crozier, and he also, what I thought was weird about that was that he, all those sailors that were giving him, the ovation, they were packed pretty closely. No one was observing any social distancing. Anybody else notice that? I tweeted about that. I was like, is that really worth it? And then somebody tweeted me a picture of the quarters that you have when you're on a naval sub. Yeah, you're always really close. You're literally sleeping right on top of each other. So I think if you're going to get sick on the ship, you're going to get sick. Moving on. Stephanie Grisham is no longer the president's press secretary. But was she really ever? Did she ever hold a press avail? Her departure from that job was announced Tuesday, with former Trump campaign spokesperson Kayleigh McEnany set to be her replacement. You guys, I used to hang out with that woman, Kayleigh McEnany. My friend dated her. My producer, Alfred's brother, Bill, dated her, and we used to hang out.
Oh, my God.
She worked at Fox News, and I hung out with her a couple times. She was fine.
I'm biting my tongue not to ask what I want to ask.
Ask it.
Be nice.
I don't have to answer it.
Is she as stupid as she comes across on the air?
She didn't seem.
Oh, my God.
No, she didn't seem. I think she's not that stupid. I think she's got to be someone intelligent to come up with to be able to lie the way that she does. It requires a certain intelligence, a lack of any morality or moral compass. But to be able to do that, she'll lie about anything all the time. I'm surprised you didn't have that job earlier. A few Twitter and Titter responses aggregated by Mediaite. Here's Keith Boykin, CNN commentator. He said, "How do you leave a job you never did?" in reference to Stephanie Grisham stepping down. Helen Kennedy is a reporter. She wrote, White House Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham, twice as many DUIs as press briefings. That's quite a legacy. Washington Post, Ruth Marcus. And so Stephanie Grisham becomes a Jeopardy question. She was the White House press secretary, but never held a press briefing. And the new president's new press secretary, who we were just talking about, Kayleigh, she's a birther. Mm-hmm. So fantastic.
If I remember correctly, she also had some lovely things to say about Michelle Obama, too.
Oh, great. How can anybody say anything negative about her and get away with it? Well, I guess if you're a Trump supporter. Bill Clinton's former press secretary, Joe Lockhart, says the president's a birther, the first lady is a birther, and the new chief of staff is a birther. The new press secretary is a birther. Maybe it'd be easier to list those in the White House who are not birthers.
I wonder if the anti-vaxxers, this whole thing's going to change them.
Oh, that's a great question. And we have an anti-vaxxer, not friend, but somebody in our community, like a dance parent, we'll call them. And they put out that graphic you might have seen me share on social media that just pointed to all of the other causes of death in the world and all of the numbers, like car accident, suicide, whatever else. They included abortion, which was outrageous. But they said, what, basically the point was nobody's getting upset about any of these. Like, what? Like, that was what an anti-vaxxer said. Like, no, what's the big deal? What am I missing? I'm like, all the car accidents didn't happen at the same hospital on the same day? Start there. I mean, car accidents, suicide's not contagious? How about that? I mean, it was one of the dumbest things I'd ever seen someone post on social media. I was like, how embarrassing is it that you just posted that on? What a stupid point. But it's a great question, Dan, about the anti-vaxxers. I keep asking that myself. Are they going to be in denial and not get the vaccine if there ever is one? Good question.
They really lock onto these talking points, don't they?
Yeah, sure. It's it's the what is it? The Dunning-Kruger effect, the cognitive dissonance. It doesn't matter if you find out the truth. All right. So also you've got, I said NBC John Lewis's name trending on social media today. That was terrifying because, of course, John Lewis, civil rights hero and the greatest man I ever interviewed, John Lewis, is got stage 4 pancreatic cancer. When I saw his name trending, I got really worried. But it's because he officially endorsed Joe Biden today, John Lewis. Anybody have any reaction on that? John Lewis's endorsement is a big deal, I think.
I don't see how anyone would, how he would endorse anyone else. There's no way he's fucking endorsing Trump.
Well, yeah. That's for sure.
He could have endorsed Bernie. Bernie is still in the race.
Right. That's true.
He hasn't gotten any endorsements from major players, but
Go ahead.
Kind of forgot about Bernie. He's right.
Yeah, well, nobody's getting a lot of attention given the daily press briefings. CBS Miami reporting Johnson & Johnson is saying there's a temporary shortage of Tylenol in some areas of the U.S. Tylenol is selling out or being rationed in many stores because of a belief that it might be the best way to fight the virus, or at least treat the fever. Doctors are saying Tylenol is preferred for fever over non-steroidal anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen. A spokesperson for Johnson & Johnson, the makers of Tylenol, acknowledged the shortage and said the company is working to overcome. the issue. But here's some advice that I read in addition to the story. If you're looking for Tylenol, just find acetaminophen, right? It's the generic version of Tylenol. Also, right, you can call some of the smaller pharmacies to see if they have Tylenol in stock. Support a local non-chain pharmacy. If you have kids, apparently, and they have children's Tylenol at home, you could figure out what an adult dosage is. Just guzzle that. And try to shop in the morning, apparently, when the shelves at many stores are restocked. And finally, on chloroquine. We've heard that word way too many times. I saw Dr. Aaron Carroll tweet the Atlantic magazine reporter James Hamblin as the authority on this. Taking chloroquine for COVID-19 isn't a, quote, debate where experts disagree if it's good or bad. It's one of many drugs that may influence the disease in good ways or bad. It's being studied to see if, how, and when it's safe and effective, and if, how, and when it's not. That's it. Any questions? All right.
It's an anti-parasitic. I've actually taken it. I had malaria after serving overseas, and it's not an antiviral. It's an anti-parasitic. And I don't know the ins and outs of how it might help with coronavirus, but it needs to be studied rather than just behind a podium for an orange guy to say, yes, it works.
Yeah, can't be great. A leader and go out and say such irresponsible things.
Well, so Pete, I have rheumatoid arthritis, and I take hydroxychloroquine as a regular regimen, and I can't get my prescription filled.
Oh man, you actually need it for an actual chronic issue that you have, and you can't get your prescription filled because what? A bunch of zombies are going buying it and taking it. Mm-hmm. Oh, it's terrible. I'm so sorry to hear that.
They don't know when they'll be able to refill it.
All right. Well, this was a fun experiment, everybody. I thank you for joining me. Before we go, though, I want to make sure anybody, if you want to say anything about what's going on. I know I had some technical issues here. By the way, isn't that like the story of our time, that everybody is trying to figure out how to use these chat rooms in Zoom, and everybody is having hilarious, awkward technical issues because nobody knows what the hell they're doing? Dan is a teacher out in California. How's it going for you, pal?
Well, it was funny. The Monday morning, we're trying to have our first Zoom meeting kind of like this. And, people are having a hard time getting on. People's mics are off. There's just a whole issue of things. We ended up giving up on it and going to FaceTime because we all have iPhones, and you can just click the link and that just pops up, and you get the little Brady Bunch screen and kind of zooms in and out. It was pretty cool that way.
Anybody else have any Zoom or any other Skype stories, nightmares? Anybody walk naked in front of a camera or think their camera was off while they were sitting on the toilet? No. My daughters were taking a jazz class with their jazz teacher today, and I wanted so badly to walk in front of the camera, but they would have murdered me. I was going to go out there in just my underwear and embarrass the hell out of me. But they wouldn't have taught to me for weeks. How's everybody else doing? Anybody else? I know a few people just joined us. And one of the technical issues, I think people were waiting. I somehow had to admit you. I didn't realize that. Everybody's supposed to just be able to pop in here. I apologize.
Yeah, that was pretty sad. I waited.
Oh, Karen, I am so sorry to anybody that had to wait. And anybody else.
Now, I think.
What's that?
I think that's added security for Zoom because they had some problems with people popping in meetings that they shouldn't have been in.
Oh, well, nobody's
that was my plan.
Karen. Karen's a Zoom terrorist. All right, Karen, so now you've invaded. What is it that you wanted to do or say to all of us?
I just wanted to check it out. I just joined the other day.
Well, we're psyched to have you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
And where do you live?
Outside of D.C.
How are you doing?
Depends on the day.
Right. Good answer.
Yeah.
What's a bad day?
If it's a little gloomy out and I can't get outside and the neighbors upstairs are really loud, it starts to stress me out.
That's a great example. Number one, the weather has never meant so much to me as it does now. Anybody else? Good day. What's the difference between a good day and a bad day? in pandemic land?
California.
I'm working from home.
And working from home is what?
On a computer, I redraw complex structures from government patents.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing, Michelle?
It's what I've been doing for 33 years. So,
all right,
we were able to take our computers home, and that's what I've been doing while I've been Zooming every week with various groups.
That's cool.
So I'm able to work overtime and talk to people.
I love it.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Good days, bad days? What makes a good day? What makes a bad day?
Rainy days kind of.
Rain's hard. 2 grandkids and an autistic kid can't get outside. That's a long day.
Heart goes out to Tina, of course, who's a saint.
Hard.
All right, well, I went through a whole bunch of news stories. Is there any other news story that you think is not being mentioned or should be mentioned here at the opening? Got great guests on today's show as well. Anybody else before we leave, before we wrap it?
I was listening to CNN earlier, and there was some insinuation that there may be some connection to from Trump to this chloroquine drug. Somehow he knows someone or something. I saw that and I thought, that's going to be interesting to see what happens out of that.
That he's got something to gain, something to profit from it.
That's going to be a big story.
Yeah. Yeah, the Times, I think the New York Times is reporting that he's invested. He has a small investment in the company that makes hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah.
Is that surprising?
Yeah, I think he's making some of the federal agencies stock up on it.
I think you need to stock up on a better microphone, Rudolph.
No, it's my computer, so.
That's okay.
Sounds like God coming in and making a comment.
Yeah, could you just say, this is God speaking, Rudolph?
Well, I could, but I'm not. Like I say, this is God speaking. Does that seem better on the computer?
I think Trump may be also invested in scarves. Right? Scarves.
Because they're thicker,
everybody's
they're better.
probably could just use a scarf. Everybody has a scarf, right? I mean, I'm not going to wear one, but other people who have scarves can wear a scarf.
Burberry, probably.
God, we're never getting out of here.
Oh, Pete, the main story for today, they may have a solution to start baseball season.
Yeah, I saw that. What are they going to do? They're going to play just games in Phoenix, Arizona? That's
Correct.
not happening.
Correct.
That's not happening.
That's a proposal. They haven't decided completely yet, but they may play all the games in Arizona, yes.
I don't think so.
So how does that fix? I'm sorry.
It gets
Karen, that's not going to help you get out of your apartment.
It's not. I mean,
unless you get drafted by the Kansas City Royals.
I mean, we're missing seasons.
We need somebody.
Okay? We're missing seasons. That's all.
That's it.
So we're going to have empty stands or something, empty stadiums to do that.
The Lord has spoken. All right, guys, that's it. I got to get to the show. Join me today to talk about hunger and food insecurity. 2 women who I think are anti-poverty heroes, Noreen Springstead and Rebecca Vallas. After that, Eric Segall joins me to talk about the insanity that is the Wisconsin primary. Thank you all for joining me tonight. It's so great to have your company and to be able to see your faces. And thank you for all of your support, your paid subscription on Patreon. If you want to join me, sign up right now. Click the paid subscription link on the show notes or go to PeteDominic.com or go to patreon.com/PeteDominic. And I'd love to have you be a part of the show. So I've been working on issues regarding poverty and food insecurity and lack of opportunity, employment, health care, and other issues for a long time. But even in a good economy, we've got real issues feeding Americans. Over 34 million Americans going hungry, and don't get me started about kids. Well, this collapse of the economy is dire consequences for families and individuals living on the brink. Been talking about this for a long time, long before the economy collapsed like it just has. And I thought we got to do a segment with experts, so I invited Noreen Springstead and Rebecca Vallas on together to talk about this issue. They are what I have always called anti-poverty heroes. I got them together. Here's our conversation right now. All right, joining me now to talk about all of these issues are the executive director of Why Hunger, which is a 45-year-old global organization working in over 30 countries to end hunger and advance human right to nutritious food by providing critical resources to support grassroots movements, fuel community solutions rooted in social, environmental, racial, and economic justice. It's the great Noreen Springstead. Also joining me is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where she spent the past 5 years helping to build and lead their Poverty to Prosperity program. She's also a former legal aid lawyer who, prior to joining Center for American Progress, spent several years representing low-income individuals and families in Philadelphia. Both of my guests understand what is at the roots of poverty, hunger, and unemployment, and have dedicated their careers to helping people climb out of it. Vallas and Noreen Springstead. Thank you, ladies, for joining me today. We're on Zoom. Hopefully there won't be too many technical issues, but let's get to it. First, Noreen, you are the executive director of this amazing nonprofit who I've worked with many times. Tell me exactly what the situation has been like for people living at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale before the pandemic started.
Hunger has been a major social issue in America and around the world for centuries, right? So this is not a new revelation that people are in need of food assistance. I can tell you in the U.S., for the past close to 50 years, when the first food bank started in 1967 in Phoenix, Arizona, as a response to people in need of food assistance, we have had 12% of the population consistently in need of help. It obviously spikes in times of recessions. It spiked after 9/11. But 12% of the population have been food insecure, or that's a clinical term for they are hungry. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. So those 37 million Americans in February, when unemployment was 3.5%, there were still 37 million people going hungry.
And many of them were working.
That's right. Half of those people were working and going to food pantries and soup kitchens and depending on food banks to feed themselves and their families. That's true for SNAP, which is food stamps in the U.S. Half of the people are working.
All right, Vallas, what would you add to what Noreen said about the situation before the pandemic began in terms of the American economy? And, of course, we got to talk about what the pandemic lays bare as well.
Yeah, no, and Pete, you're predicting totally where I was going to go with this. You know, I think the biggest takeaway, and I want to get into the hunger side of this specifically as well, but the biggest sort of meta takeaway from this moment is that the economy that Trump was starting to run on, that he was painting as the best economy ever. Your listeners can't see me. I've got huge scare quotes as I'm saying that, right? You know, incredibly low unemployment, a stock market he was bragging about. People started to believe him and really believe that we had this incredibly strong economy. And what this moment has really laid bare is that in a lot of ways that quote unquote strong economy was a hoax. It was a house of cards that was built on making the richest people in this country even richer with every possible piece of legislation the Republicans that control the Senate and this White House could team up to get through, and overwhelmingly, handing out tax cuts to incredibly wealthy corporations. That's been what we've seen this administration focus on since Trump got into the White House. And I think what we're seeing is the chickens finally coming home to roost, where what happens when you've hollowed out the middle class, when you have half the country or more living paycheck to paycheck, when 43% of Americans, right, that's not some them on the other side of the tracks, right, 43% of Americans can't afford food and housing and health care. What that tells you is that the economy is only working for the wealthiest people in this country, and it's left everybody else behind. And now in the middle of this pandemic, we finally have people realizing that you can't define an economy based only on how the wealthiest are doing. You have to define the economy based on how everyday Americans are doing. And that is why what we're about to head into is a lot different and a lot harsher than what so many other European countries who have completely different policy landscapes that are based on human rights are going to see.
Yeah, well said. Both of you ladies know that I lost my job at SiriusXM back in October and have been rebuilding struggling and have been trying to figure it out, and we're not financially secure. But I think about the people who are really living on the edge, who don't have any, $400 in the bank for an emergency. I've got 2 fridges and a pantry full of food. I'm working now. My wife is working. So most Americans are struggling one way or another, but I wanted to talk with you both about the sense of urgency that is right now in terms of people that are literally hungry right now. Noreen, you work with all of these different food pantries all over the country. What are the calls your organization, Why Hunger, are getting?
Pete, it is so grim and dire. I have 3 decades of experience in this work. People are calling sobbing. They have not had food in their house for days. I volunteered on Monday at our partner agency, the Center for Food Action in New Jersey, Bergen County, one of the richest counties in the country. People walking up with this just look of desperation. They have never been in this situation. They're not even walking up. They have to drive up because of all the social distancing and the hurdle. So not only are food pantries trying to meet double the demand of people who've never been in this situation before because they're not working, the hurdles for volunteers, harder to have volunteers. They have to do all these sanitizing measures and have the equipment for volunteers to even do this. So I was like just buckled under from just the despair that people feel. And in this moment, I was in the supermarket. I can go to the supermarket and think about what I can shop for. I felt that maybe the nation could have great empathy for what people feel every single time they go to the supermarket. I was a single mom for 10 years. I know what it feels like to put your food on the belt and be like, am I going to have enough to pay for this? Well, now we're all feeling that the food is not there. I don't have a job. I don't have the money to pay for it. So maybe there will be a great national empathy. The calls to our hunger hotline have doubled. We took more calls in the first 3 days of April than in the entire month of January. And this is anecdotal evidence also suggests that the food banks, the pantries, and the kitchens are also basically 50% increase in the demand. And just going back a little bit to what Rebecca said, we created this mythology about the stock market and this bright, shiny thing that's going to be the barometer of the health of the nation. And we forgot to look at what girds the nation are these restaurant workers, these supermarket workers. They are now essential workers, right? The people that form the backbone of blue-collar jobs and the food system. And we had to fight like hell to try to get them $15 an hour. Now they are providing your families the food that they need. Think about that. We had no money to pay them an increase in an hourly wage. And now they are the essential lifeline to food in America.
I almost feel like I don't have to ask a question, Rebecca, but you've been fighting for that $15 minimum wage and other benefits for your entire career. But what would you say in terms of what you've heard? You host your podcast, Off Kilter Podcast. Everybody should listen to it as well. What have you heard about what the pandemic changes immediately for people that are living on the brink?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first thing to say, right, is, and I think that it just really needs to be like the framework that everybody really comes back to as we talk about what's happening to the economy right now. We intentionally turned the economy off. We closed the country for business, right? And we did that for public health reasons. It was the right thing to do. Social distancing was the way to flatten the curve. Closing restaurants and bars was the way to flatten the curve. And the reason we need to keep that in mind is because as, and Noreen was just describing this, as advocates struggle and scramble to try to get Congress to do even just the basic things that other countries are taking for granted and laughing at us for fighting over, like like making sure that people have their income at least partially, if not completely, replaced through jobless benefits, making sure that people have food assistance so that they can continue to feed their families, making sure that people aren't losing their employer-provided health insurance, right? At every turn so far, our federal government has either failed to show the leadership that we've needed or has made decisions that have put workers second or last. Perhaps the best example of this, and food stamps is at the core of this, right? So really what we're talking about here with hunger. But in that major stimulus package, as it's being called, that was $2 trillion, the CARES Act, Congress authorized a $500 billion corporate slush fund, almost no strings for Treasury to just hand out to Trump's friends and cronies. And they could not find a dollar to increase food stamps for the millions and millions of families who have already run out of food because, as you said, Pete, they didn't have $400 in the bank to start with. Right. That's the politics that we're dealing with. And so when you think about that uptick in calls that's happening to food banks, when you think about the pictures and the videos we're seeing on Twitter of cars for miles waiting in line for food banks, right? Because of what families are facing, your listeners need to remember this was a political choice. It didn't have to be this way, and it still doesn't. And there's still something and a lot that Congress can and should do. But we don't know what we're going to see until Mitch McConnell tells.
We lost you right there at the end. Until the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell tells us what they're going to do in the Senate.
We don't know what they're going to do until he basically tells us he cares enough to bring the Senate back and prioritize this. And we certainly don't have reason to believe that workers are going to be centered until we hear them starting to talk about emergency unemployment extensions, food stamps being top of that list, an eviction freeze, and a freeze on foreclosures for families who can't pay their rent and mortgage. There's all these basic things that still have not been prioritized that every other developed country that has been hit by this pandemic has realized needed to be day one stuff so that the entire country and all the workers being impacted didn't end up facing devastation that in many cases is going to last many, many years, long past whenever we're starting to talk about a recovery.
In this week's Washington Post, Catherine Rampell's column, The Next Threat, Hunger in America, where she writes that the federal government has taken steps designed to beef up food assistance. These include funding for additional commodity purchases from farmers, for emergency food programs, and allowing states to temporarily give more households the maximum food stamp benefit. But much more needs to be done, she says. First, the Agriculture Department needs to reduce cumbersome paperwork requirements for food banks and food pantries. Noreen, do you know anything about that? Have you heard about that? Is that an issue that you've heard food banks and food pantries are dealing with?
They don't have time to deal with paperwork. The need is there. Just look at that, the film footage of the Pittsburgh Food Bank, a mile long of cars. People waited 5 hours for food. What are we talking about here? And what I think Rebecca is really getting to, which is, are there opportunities for a paradigm shift? We've been fighting this fight for a long time. And Rebecca's advocating why Hunger is advocating for, which is a rights-based framework, the human right to food. We're squabbling over food stamp dollars because it's an ideological battle. There is a choice that can be made. Food stamps SNAP exists as a federal entitlement and is most effective in times of crisis because it can move money down to people at a very local level all across the nation, and $1 of SNAP generates $1.70 in economic activity. It's good for the corner grocery store. It's good for the big box store. It's good for the supermarket. It gets food into people's homes. It gives them the human dignity to purchase it themselves. So it's a no-brainer. Why are we not having this conversation? I don't know. $500 billion to corporations versus getting dollars into the hands of people to feed themselves and their families, just like anyone would shop in the grocery store. That is something that could be fast-tracked and moved very quickly. Another paradigm shift is, why did we choose unemployment rather than a jobs guarantee, where we could move out of this much more quickly, keep the payrolls going? I mean, that train has left the station, but we need to think differently. We need to think about a well-nourished, a healthy, a prosperous United States of America. We don't do that. We could actually be dealing with this pandemic or the next one to come very differently if everybody had reserves of health, reserves of wealth, all kinds of different reserves. And I think maybe there's an opportunity in this to shift the conversation.
Rebecca, what would you add to that? Do you think that we have an opportunity? And if so, what policies would you advocate to enact or change right away?
Yeah, I think we don't have any other choice than to seize this moment to completely rethink and rebuild our economy on the other side. We don't have enough time right now to get into everything that I would put on that wish list because you know me, I have long wish lists, Pete, but
I'm here for them.
You're here for them. Well, and it's a lot of what we've actually been covering on Off Kilter. You mentioned the show I host. We've been doing a series of COVID-19 conversations, really kind of getting into these policies that we should have. But I would say, I'm really struck that this moment is an incredible opportunity for something that Naomi Klein once termed the shock doctrine to really kind of come into play here, right? The idea is that by there being enough of a sort of a shock to the national conscience about a particular crisis, it forces you over the edge to where you actually have to have change. There's a mandate for change. And I would say that in this moment, the shock doctrine, and I was just actually talking about this with my friend Helene Olen over at the Washington Post. A lot of us are thinking about this, that the shock doctrine we need in force right now is for the American worker. It's for a new social contract in this country that is human rights based, as Noreen was saying. And we've already seen a lot of bubbling up of this, right, from Occupy that translated into Bernie Sanders and the 99%, the 1%, and then it was Thomas Piketty, and on and on. It's been a journey to get to this moment, but here we are in the middle of a crisis that you have to be living under a rock or some kind of a soulless monster not to see the obvious takeaway that what we need in this country is not just an economy that works for everyone instead of just the wealthy few that gets us back to the $15 minimum wage you were talking about, right? So that people can actually earn enough to feed their families. But we also need a robust social insurance system that's there for you, right? Not just in times of pandemic, but if you lose your job, if you get sick, if you have a baby, right? I mean, these are commonplace life experiences that every other developed country understands we need to have basic protections in place for. And so I am hoping that the takeaway from this moment is that shock doctrine that forces us to finally reckon on a bipartisan, nonpartisan basis with the policies that we are decades behind in putting in place.
What about just marrying somebody with family money? Ladies, where are you on that policy?
A lot faster.
Well, you mentioned The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, but the subtitle of that book is The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, another term she coined. And that is something I'm really concerned about as well, is that in this disaster, you have the vultures coming in and taking all of the money that is meant for people to get back up on their feet and or just feed themselves. So I'm not sure if you know any way to prevent that, but that's something that we always see during these disasters.
The excuses will be made, right? We don't have time to do that now. I mean, it took the Business Roundtable, how long? 30 years to say, oh, maybe we should look beyond shareholder value and look at our employees and our consumers. How cavalier. No, we need to look at our workers, our consumers, our employees now. There's no choice. So maybe there will be a people's movement or some sort of revolt, because the bottom line is we had the money all along. We had no problem paying for it in an emergency. And Trump will now go down as the greatest socialist president in the history of the country.
It's a really great point, really, that bears repeating, right, about we have the money. It's back to what I said before, and I'm borrowing words from Congressman Jim McGovern when I say it. Hunger in America is a political choice. It's not something that just will always be with us, right? I mean, that's how some people think about it. Oh, the poor and the hungry will always be with us. No, it's a political choice. We're making it. And if people want to understand how inexpensive, relatively speaking, it is to eliminate hunger,
It is a political choice.
I was going to say that it's a political choice because, and just case in point, the tax cuts that the Republican tax law gave to the top 1% just a couple of years ago, just to the top 1%, cost more than the entire food stamp program. And if that doesn't say it all, I don't know what does.
I've never heard it framed that way.
So, Rebecca, say that one more time.
The tax cuts that Trump and the Republicans in Congress handed to their rich friends, just the top 1% in 2017 and 2018, cost more than the entire food stamp program, which helps before the pandemic about 37 million people.
Noreen, I'm confused if you want Rebecca to repeat that for the weight that point holds or because she was cutting out earlier. But either way, I'm glad that you did.
No, the obviously the weight of what that point holds, because I've been thinking about this, the SNAP budget before all this happened. We spent $70 billion, right, to keep people fed. Don't we want people living in prosperity so we don't have to spend that $70 billion, that they can be contributing, that they can be buying their own food with dignity? I mean, just on an economic level and a human level, it makes sense. But we do have the money to give away to other things.
All right, ladies. Why Hunger? Whyhunger.org. That's Noreen Springstead. Support that organization. Rebecca Vallas, listen to her podcast, The Off Kilter and Center for American Progress. Follow her on Twitter at, is it R Vallas or Rebecca Vallas? I just lost
Rebecca Vallas.
She's so good on Twitter as well. And now, just here in closing, Noreen, you first, and then Rebecca, just compliment me for getting the two of you together.
I was going to say, you got us all fired up, and now it's over, Pete. Pete, thank you. You're a champion. You're a warrior. You get it. I hope this opens more people's eyes that we all should be living in a world free from hunger and in prosperity. Every single American. We shouldn't be on the edge. So when a crisis comes, because there's going to be another one, we are more resilient and prepared for it.
Final word, Rebecca. You don't have to compliment me.
Yeah, I know. I'm always happy to compliment you. And Pete, I was going to compliment you on hoodwinking me into coming on your show by telling me this was supposed to be a remote happy hour. What a trick.
I saw Pete drinking.
I just have my espresso, but that worked. I'll do whatever it takes to get you on, Rebecca, and to get the both of you together is awesome. Thank you very much for joining me. I look forward to doing this again.
Guys.
Keep up the good work. Rebecca Vallas, Noreen Springstead, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, how good were those two? Wasn't that great? I really enjoyed it. I wasn't sure how that was going to work, getting them both on together, and technically, would they have good chemistry? Boy, they were awesome together. Noreen Springstead, Rebecca Vallas, Why Hunger, and the Off Kilter podcast, Center for American Progress, Poverty to Prosperity Program. Hunger, ladies and gentlemen, we can solve it. In the best of times, can we? In the worst of times, we will soon find out. But do whatever you can. Pay attention to those who are most vulnerable right now. Now, the other big issue, the big story of yesterday was that Wisconsin Republicans forced voters and volunteers to go to the polls and risk their lives to cast a vote instead of postponing it the way so many other states have. This is a constitutional issue. The Supreme Court actually weighed in on it. So I reached out to Eric Segall, who wrote a great article that is getting a lot of attention. And we wanted to talk about this issue. We had a wide-ranging conversation, and he was in rare form. He was really serious and really concerned in this conversation, as you'll hear in his voice and in his words. And let me stop using words and just get to our interview right now. So against the advice of public health officials and experts and the wishes of their own governor, who's a Democrat, Wisconsin held its Democratic primary yesterday in the middle of a pandemic. This is a travesty for many reasons, and here to join us to unpack it, our expert today, the legal eagle, Eric Segall, who is the author of two awesome books, Supreme Myths and Originalism as Faith. He is a constitutional law professor at Georgia State University, tweeting at @eSpinSegall. Eric, thank you very much for joining me. You got a great piece about this very important issue at Dorf on Law. Hi.
Hi, Pete. Yeah, I love joining you, and I've been doing that for a long time. I wish I didn't have to join you today because we shouldn't be talking about this because this never should have happened.
Right.
What happened yesterday is a travesty. We won't know the effects of that travesty for a long time. But I'm not really in a joking mood. You and I joke around a lot. I'm not joking around today. This is bad stuff.
Yeah, we will try to find some levity somewhere. But at the end of your piece, you write at Dorf on Law, across the country, GOP-controlled legislatures with the full blessing of the Republican-controlled Supreme Court are doing everything they can to put obstacles in the way of people voting. This tsunami of voter suppression came to a head yesterday when the GOP-controlled Wisconsin legislature decided to hold an election during a pandemic when people in their own state are being told to stay indoors. Segall, what did the United States Supreme Court do to make matters worse?
So let's start at the beginning. The governor issued a stay-at-home order a couple of weeks ago, late March, around the time other people were doing it. And at that moment in time, people in Wisconsin realized that their primary a few weeks away was going to be really problematic, because who wants to stand in line at a voting booth during a pandemic? That's very contagious. So all kinds of legal machinations went on in lower courts, but eventually what a lower district court judge decided was the best that we could do under these Trump. Well, first of all, the Republican legislature should have canceled the election, but it didn't do that because the Republican legislature canceled the election, postponed the election, right. which happened in Georgia. It's happened in many other states. It's obviously the right answer. Let's just stop right there for a minute. The right answer here was not have the election yesterday. That's the right answer. That's what almost every other state did. But Republicans don't want people to vote. And what's the best way in not getting people to vote? Do it during a pandemic. So that's the first thing. Second, Democrats go to court, and eventually the district court judge, who is overwhelmed and it's all last minute and nothing is perfect here, says, all right, the least we can do is give people time to get their absentee ballots in, because it wasn't until March 24th that people realized the election wouldn't be postponed. Then they asked for absentee ballots, right. And those were not all going to be received by yesterday. So at the district court, the day of the election, so the district court judge said any ballot postmarked before April 13th, which is a week from yesterday, would be counted. And the Supreme Court reversed that opinion. And the Supreme Court said, no, the ballot has to be postmarked by yesterday. Problem being, many, many people wouldn't have received in the mail their absentee ballot, which gave the people a choice. And law professor Leah Littman wrote about this in The Atlantic. It's a great piece. I recommend people to it. It's not too dissimilar from mine, with one exception. But she kind of put it this way. It gave them the choice of voting or risking death. And what I wrote about today, and what is so important, I think, for the American people to understand, is what happened yesterday is a symbol. It's really bad for the people of Wisconsin. I hope people don't die because of this. We'll only see how that plays out. But
they will. People,
yes. Yes.
It's sadly fairly easy to predict, especially because many of the volunteers are senior citizens, and a lot of them are staying home. But go ahead. Sorry.
Yes. No, you were right to interrupt, and that's exactly right. And the pictures from yesterday are harrowing. People standing in lines, doing their best to kind of social distance, but it really wasn't, an easy thing to do. So what I wrote about on Dorf on Law, because this is just Wisconsin, but this is going to happen in more and more states and leading up, of course, to the presidential election in November. This is the symbolic culmination, if you will, of a decade-long effort by the Republican National Committee, the Republican Party, to stop as many people from voting as possible. So let's go back.
Before we go back, and this is the most important part of this conversation, is everybody has to understand the history of the Voting Rights Act and Shelby County and et cetera. But why does it matter so much? The Wisconsin primary yesterday had a lot of local elections that mattered a great deal, judges and sheriffs, et cetera. But, a lot of people will look at the presidential nomination, say, obviously Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. And, it's a foregone conclusion that Joe Biden is going to be the Democratic nominee. So why do the remaining primaries matter that much for the outcome of the nominating process, if not for just the local elections, which obviously do matter?
Well, the one yesterday involved the Wisconsin Supreme Court. The Wisconsin Supreme Court, I believe, is 3-3 right now. Whoever gets the next seat, whether it's Republican or Democrat, is going to be really important.
So that vote was suppressed.
Here's the connection. There are going to be voting, there's going to be voting disputes in Wisconsin in these swing states prior to the election in November. Who decides the outcome of now some of those disputes would go to the Supreme Court, of course. Many of them might, but some won't. And state Supreme Courts are incredibly important here in determining if the Republican Party can stop as many people from voting as they want to. And that's the problem. The way people vote in states directly affects the presidential election. But even forgetting that, Wisconsin is a big state with a lot of people, and their local elections are incredibly important. I live in Georgia. We are considered to be a red state heading towards purple. I've been told that for years. So
Hold
I don't know if that's true.
Hold on. Stop at purple.
Yeah.
Stop talking.
Yeah.
Stop at purple. I'm getting another call, and that sucks. Hold on. Stop at Georgia. We'll make that point again. Hold on. Can you pick up where you were?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I live in Georgia. It is a red state, supposedly going to be purple soon, but our governor right now is incredibly conservative and Republican, and our legislature is both, incredibly Republican and conservative, but we put off our primary, Pete. Wisconsin should have put it off, and that's a big deal, even if it only applies to Wisconsin. So I want to make that point. I don't want to diminish, because it's going to make people expose themselves to the virus and possibly die.
Right.
But what I really want to say is in the midterm elections of 2010, 2 years into President Obama's first term, the Republicans swept state houses across the country. And this started a little bit earlier than that, but beginning in 2010, what happened was Republicans went on a national crusade to do as many things as they can to stop as many people as possible from voting. And let me just go list some of these things that they did.
Sure.
And of course, all the people they're stopping from voting, generally speaking, are people of color or young people, who generally speaking vote Democrat more than Republican. So we have voter ID requirements. You've talked about that a lot. Rules that deter college students from voting. Criminalizing efforts to organize voting drives, closing voting places on Sundays, which is a big deal for African Americans, reducing the number of voting places in kind of urban and communities where people of color live, felon disenfranchisement, which has an effect on people of color more than on whites, right. And of course, the big case out of Ohio a couple of years ago, where Ohio purged voter rolls in a way that helped Republicans. That case went to the Supreme Court. Now, so that's the Republican Party, and they've been doing it for over a decade, and it's heinous. But they've been doing it for all that time with the able assistance of the United States Supreme Court.
Right.
That's where we get to Shelby County, because in the worst of these states, in terms of racial discrimination in voting, Texas, North Carolina, and places that were previously covered by the Voting Rights Act. And what that meant was the 11 or 12 states that had long histories of racial discrimination in voting, they had to report to the Department of Justice or a federal court in D.C. if they were going to change their voting procedures so that we could make sure they weren't doing it deliberately to hurt people of color or even have the effect of hurting.
I do feel like whenever you talk about this, it's worthy to go further back. Just to mention that the Voting Rights Act was established in 1965, and it was really the centerpiece of Dr. Martin Luther King's civil rights movement.
Yes, it was everything, because from 1868 to 1965, throughout most of the South, whites did just about anything they could to stop black people from voting.
So
now, blacks had Go ahead.
So just to frame it, though, just to be this long fight where people lost their lives and had their heads smashed in to gain this right was finally achieved in 1965 when President
I do want to make the point, though, that the right was enshrined in our Constitution in 1868 at least for black men. It took until 1965 to begin the process of really enforcing that right. I want to make that point. Go ahead.
Fair enough. No, that's fine. The point is, all of that fight, which was generations long, was rolled back in 2010 by the conservative-led Supreme Court. I mean,
2014, but yes.
2014, but just to be clear, Dr. King's work was rolled back, and it's always also important to mention the Voting Rights Act was reaffirmed by the United States Senate with all of the Republicans in the Senate voting for it unanimously. The court overturned the Senate's confirmation of the Voting Rights Act, and you were probably going to say that, but I wanted to make sure that history was included. And what did I get wrong?
And it's incredibly important. You did nothing wrong. And I'll just add to your brilliant recitation which was that President Bush, not President Obama, not President Clinton, not John F. Kennedy, but President Bush, the second President Bush, when he signed the Voting Rights Act that was unanimously passed by the Senate and almost unanimously in the House, he said, this is so important and we have so much more work to do.
Right.
That's what he said.
Yeah,
that's what he said.
Really important. I don't think President Bush was
Dominic.
I don't think President Bush was a traditionally racist person at all. I really think he understood that stuff and went with it when he had to go with it, I suppose.
Well, neither was he a bleeding heart liberal, is my point.
Well, of course, but it's important to say that as soon as the Voting Rights Act was gutted by the conservative-led Supreme Court, as soon as it happened, you wrote about this, they passed racist laws in a number of states.
Can I be specific?
Yes, please.
So your listeners
Professor.
can understand? Yeah. The reaction – I'm quoting someone else who documented it. The reaction to Shelby County was immediate. The state of Texas announced that its voter ID requirement, which had been blocked as discriminatory, would go into effect before the next election. North Carolina, likewise, introduced a series of new measures, including a voter ID requirement, a shortened early voting period, a requirement that voters only cast their ballot in their assigned precinct, and the elimination of same-day registration and voting, which, by the way, really hurts people of color, eliminating measures that had increased voter turnout among African Americans. The state of Alabama, likewise, introduced a voter ID requirement and then shuttered or closed offices in predominantly black counties. This all happened in the days after Shelby County, and they knew it. Don't think for 1 second the Supreme Court didn't know it. And that, Pete, that's the point I really want to make. And I want to just rant for a minute here about my profession.
Have at it.
So I've mentioned to you before, and you've laughed at me before.
I'm drinking a Michelob Ultra. You enjoy it.
That I belong to a con law list, a list of con law professors. And there were literally hundreds, I think maybe over 1,000 people who subscribe to this list, and it's very helpful, and I enjoy the list. But on days like this, it drives me crazy because I have all these constitutional law professors who are fighting over the decision last night by the Supreme Court not to allow that week extension of absentee voting, which is what's going to cause thousands of people, at least in Wisconsin, to go vote on a day when they should be home because they were told you don't have the absentee ballot voter time that you need. Now, so my friends, my colleagues, my con law professors are on this list going through all this legal doctrine. But I'm just going to say it.
It's all bullshit.
It's all bullshit.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
We know. We can trace that the Republicans, in fact, Senator Whitehouse, Sheldon Whitehouse, who wrote an article, and it's not a perfect article, so there are some flaws in it. But his overall point was accurate. He said, at the time he wrote the article about 6 months ago, that of the 72 Supreme Court cases that raised direct political issues and direct political stakes in the Roberts Court, Republicans have won 73 out of 73. Now, that's a little bit incorrect because he's not counting the same-sex marriage cases, and he's not counting a few other cases. But generally speaking, But Obergefell didn't involve the same-sex marriage cases did not implicate voting, right, or elections. He's talking about election cases and voting cases. Republicans always win in the Roberts Court. They always win. So I don't understand, I'm sorry, I'm ranting, why con law professors can't just say that. We've looked at it, and since 2006, when the Roberts Court began, Republicans always win voting rights cases. Like, why can't now there are some minor exceptions in temporary type procedural postures, but for almost every important case, the Republicans win. Why can't they say that? Because that's what's going on.
Well,
and yesterday it might I'm sorry, on Monday night, their decision on Monday night might very well kill people on Tuesday.
Right. That's what's phenomenal. It's almost like Eric, that no one in your world of con law or in the world of activists, civil rights activists, or Ari Berman, of course, who's been the best journalist on voting rights, had ever really thought about or imagined that going to vote would be risking your life. Because
that's why
that hypothetical, it doesn't make any sense. No one ever thought that would be the case, unless you always document that inspiring story of the senior citizen or the disabled person that did whatever they could to go and have their vote counted. But no one would ever thought this, and yet it happened. And Republicans were craven enough to force the vote. Now, you could look at the Democratic governor there in Wisconsin and say he should have got on this earlier. He was a little late to the party. He had enough cases of coronavirus in Wisconsin.
No, but there was a reason. But Pete, there was another reason. You're right, but there was another reason. So let me give the reason why the governor.
All I was going to say is, if you would have let me finish the point, I would never interrupt you. I've never interrupted you. is all they had to do is postpone it. They could have just postponed it.
Well, and that's the Republic. So I wanted to be clear. I'm not blaming the Supreme Court for not postponing the election. That they had nothing to do with it. That was the Republican legislature. But that's the point, though. What's happened since 2010 is a combination of two terrible things. Republican legislatures and where they have Republican governors have tried everything they can do to stop people of color and really most people from voting. Low turnout helps Republicans, and that's just the way that works in most places. And yesterday, the election yesterday, which never should have happened, was not caused by the Supreme Court. It was caused by the Republican legislature. But less people would have voted. Many less people would have voted had the Supreme Court had upheld the weak extension on the absentee voting. And in that sense, Pete, it is the Supreme Court who, if people die because of yesterday's vote, I don't know if they will, but I hope they don't. I really hope they don't. But if they do, that can be laid to some degree on the Supreme Court. Because,
quickly fact check a tweet for me.
Yeah. Yes.
This is my tweet. Hashtag voter ID requirements are the most obvious form of systemic racism. Those who will support it will tell you that you need an ID to buy alcohol. Why shouldn't you need one to vote? Number one, you show ID when you register to vote. Number two, voter fraud isn't a problem. And number three, voting is a constitutional right and buying beer is not. What would you add to that, or what's wrong with that?
I would just say in-person voter fraud is not a problem. For two reasons. You said voter fraud is not a problem. I would say in-person voter fraud is not a problem because voter ID only speaks to in-person voter fraud. And I happen to think in a lot of places voter fraud is a problem, but it's not. It is absolutely not.
What do you mean? Where is voter fraud a problem?
No,
where is voter fraud been a problem that has affected the outcome of an election is the important question.
Right.
Because car accidents are a problem, but you can't prevent all of them. And so if absentee voter voter fraud is a problem, I want you to explain that. But more importantly, has it ever affected the outcome of any election?
Yes, my friend.
When?
Well, let me tell you. But this is not anything that can be cured by voter ID laws. Is the point we have to be? So we can hold two ideas in our heads, maybe even three. One, voter ID laws, as Ari Berman and Rick Hasen and I hold myself out as a constitutional law expert. I'm not an election law expert. I know a lot about it, but not like Ari Berman and Rick Hasen. But they will tell you that there's absolutely no reason to have a voter ID requirement. In-person voter fraud almost never happens. Or in fact, in some situations, in some states, it's never happened, and they've documented that. So I agree with that. Voter fraud is a different issue, Pete. and it doesn't implicate what we're talking about. But let me just give you an example. There is some evidence there's voter fraud in absentee ballots, but again, that's irrelevant to in-person voter fraud. But where voter fraud really happens is in counting votes. So just to be nonpartisan about this, because
okay.
I was accused today on my con law list of being too partisan. John F. Kennedy does not get elected. You know this.
Right.
If Mayor Daley doesn't miscount.
Yeah, I know, but you got to go back to 1963. Then
no, I don't think so. Really. I don't think so. Lyndon Johnson did a few years later.
Okay, well, in the last 30 years, Segall.
No. I think voter fraud happens. I think voter fraud happened in Georgia in
terms of
election.
counting votes, though,
yes.
but not in terms of individuals fraudulently voting. How about this quote of my tweet? Is this true? Somebody named Mark Florida said, registering to vote is systemic racism because it requires ID. Every other modern country doesn't require registration. Registration. You simply go to your poll, identify yourself by showing ID, then vote. Every other country. Is that true?
Well, let me tell you what, Rick, again, you know me, I'd like to talk about what I know about.
Yeah, I'm not sure you're an expert on other countries, voting systems.
Right. But what Rick Hasen has proposed, and I think this is just sounds right to me, and he is one of the leading experts, is we should move to a system that other countries have. Now there are some people who get upset about this in America, of basically everybody gets a universal ID and then you just vote. You don't need registration. So in that sense, this guy is right. In other words, we get a government-issued ID card, and everybody, and then you vote with that, and you never worry about registration. And that's what he's recommended, and it makes perfect sense to me. Now, there are civil libertarians who will say, "Oh, but the government's going to spy on you, and this is the way to give chips." And my response to all of that is, if the government wants to spy on you now, they can spy on you now.
Yeah.
I'm not worried about that. So, but let's go back to the original idea here, which is in-person, the voter ID requirements, which in this country is basically a poll tax.
Yeah, it's a poll tax, which is some serious early 20th century racism.
Yes,
serious and horrible shit. Poll taxes. Yes. They punish people for the color of their skin,
and poor people, Pete, and
poor people,
and the elderly in rural.
Elderly.
I will never forget when you and I. Let's reminisce a little bit, my friend.
Go ahead.
You and I were doing a show on this once years ago, and we were having a great conversation. And somebody from Texas called, and because of his accent, one immediately, even though I lived in the South for 30 years, I'm from New York. One immediately starts thinking. But anyway, he was really, really, really smart.
Starts thinking what? That they're going to have a point of view because they're Confederate.
You start thinking, yes.
Yeah.
He explained to us in great detail how rural elderly voters are so financially impacted by Texas's really strict voter ID requirement, which was only possible because Shelby County was overturned.
Huh.
And I'll never forget it because I thought a lot of things at the time. I thought, wow, Pete has great listeners.
Yeah.
A. B, I knew this kind of as a general proposition, but he really came with stuff. He came with some data, and it's true. If you live in rural Georgia, which is much smaller than Texas, if you live in rural Georgia and you're elderly and you haven't looked at your records or your files, in 80 years, and you don't have any ID, and the only way to get an ID is to go to a Department of Motor Vehicles, where in theory you can get it for a small amount of money, but you have to get to the Department of Motor Vehicles, and this just got said in Texas, and there's no mass transportation to get you there.
But just to be clear, when you talk about all the obstacles that whoever it is, senior citizens, people of color, young people have to overcome, some people will dismiss that and say it's not too much to ask a person for their right to vote, and that is, in any democracy in the world, an idea that lives on the top of bullshit mountain. Yes or no?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
It is the very top of bullshit mountain. But even worse, in this country, of course, we're generalizing here, but it is a generalization with enormous accuracy. In this country, the people who are disenfranchised by those kinds of things invariably mostly vote for the Democratic Party. And so it's not, you know, it wouldn't be quite, I mean, it'd be bad under any circumstances, but it's so partisan. And so I had a student in class a few years ago, really, and a very smart student. And I love this when this happens, really pushed me on this, like your Twitter person saying, why shouldn't people have to show an ID to vote? And we have to show an ID to this and that and the other thing, and really pushing me on this. And I was prepared and I had data. And this is like 5 years ago, but I said something to the effect of, well, my count is 21 or 22 states, give or take, have voter ID requirements. And look at the legislatures in all of those states. And in virtually every state, there was one exception, but one, the votes were completely partisan. Every Republican voted for it. Every Democrat voted against it. You tell me why. You explain that to me, because you won't find that consensus even on abortion or affirmative action or anything else. And the answer is because Republicans know that the harder they make it to vote in most places, the more likely they are to be reelected. And by the way, didn't Trump just say this out loud last week?
Yes,
didn't Trump
he did.
Say?
He did. Yes. What did he say again? What was the exact quote?
He said if more people voted, it hurts Republicans. I'm paraphrasing. That's what he said.
Just to be clear, what is at the heart of the idea of democracy, and how has that evolved in time in this country? Because, you know, from white men getting the right to vote, then black men getting the right to vote, then, of course, women getting the right to vote. But at some point, your gender and race was supposed to not matter. And in other nations and democracies throughout history, I would imagine that a similar threshold is agreed upon in terms of age and gender. At this point, you have the right as a citizen to vote. But all of the obstacles that are put in the way to discriminate against a voter who is likely to vote, generally speaking, in this country, for Democrats. But specifically at the heart of democracy, don't experts, philosophers, those who believe in democracy, believe that everybody should have easy access to voting?
Well, that, my friend, is a complicated question. No, it's not. What you're asking me,
just white landowners, then?
What you're asking me is the universal franchise. You asked me two questions, I assume. Has it traditionally been thought of as an essential component of democracy, and should it be an essential component of democracy?
Okay, yeah.
I'm going to surprise you. As far as the historical thing, no, of course not. Thomas Jefferson didn't think everybody should vote. As late as, I was just doing this research to have a debate with this ridiculous originalist. In the late 19th century in America, women, some states, basically states said men could vote but not women, and a woman sued, and the Supreme Court said, of course women can't vote. That's ridiculous. Or states can stop women from voting. That's ridiculous. So historically, that idea is a very modern 20th century idea, I think, in most parts of the world. Your second question is more interesting, though. Is the universal franchise an essential component of democracy? And my answer to you, Pete, is not really. No. There are smart people who take the position that if you can't read at a third grade level, you shouldn't be allowed to vote. Whether I take that position or not, I'm not talking about. But I've heard not dumb people say that. More importantly, in our very country, we have so many core aspects of our country that are anti-democratic in the way you're putting it. Why should the people of Wyoming have the same power in the Senate as the people of California?
Well, that's a different question.
Well, but it's not really.
That's about the Electoral College.
Yeah, but it dilutes their votes. It makes the people of California have less influence in their vote than the people of Wyoming, which is not the same as barring the vote, but it's important to that. Going back to literacy, though, there is a huge number of philosophers and political scientists who are not crazy, who would say having minimal social recognition tests for voting is not a terrible idea. You wouldn't lock those people up, and you wouldn't call them racist. You would just disagree with them, which is fine, but they're not stupid.
What about like categories like that you could be subjected, like New York Jets fans? I wouldn't let them vote. Cretans, all of them. I
would not let any Boston Celtic who's ever played.
Any of the actual players that have contributed to?
Or fans, maybe. I have to think about that.
Wait, who else? Pick another category of people. How about tractor pull enthusiasts?
No, I'm okay with that.
Oh, okay.
I'm okay with that. I'm a wrestling guy. I've told you before. Right? You don't understand America if you don't understand NASCAR and wrestling.
Now, that actually is a very valid and fair point. So let me go back, but let me ask you, just looking ahead here, because you mentioned Leah Lippman's piece at The Atlantic, your piece at Dorf on Law. What do we need to be concerned about? What do we need to understand and know as we head into the presidential election? I mean, Ari Berman is losing his mind on Twitter.
Yep.
Democracy is over, and a lot of other smart people are saying similar things. Specifically, what are your concerns in the run-up to the November elections? And have you seen Elizabeth Warren's proposals?
Have we ever had a phone call where we're going to do a show or a podcast or anything, and I said to you, Pete, I'm going to be really serious today because I don't think so. I think it's the first time I've ever said that. And we've talked very serious stuff.
You may have before.
Maybe, but it's rare. I'm feeling hopeless, Pete.
You're feeling hopeless?
I'm feeling pretty. I'm with Ari. Yeah, I'm feeling. And Rick Hasen. Rick Hasen has been writing a bunch of stuff in Slate.
And what are you feeling hopeless about? What are you concerned? Because I'm the optimist here.
Yeah, but okay, I won't remind you. I use self-control there.
I don't know what that is.
I am just devastated, I think. And by the way, Leah's tone of her piece was very similar. She's a really smart young law professor who clerked for the Supreme Court recently. I'm hopeless that this combination of this Republican Supreme Court and the Republican Party and Trump is just going to be a barrier to free and fair elections. And I think, Pete, I am not advocating violence. I never advocate violence. But I do think we're going to need somebody like Martin Luther King or some kind of, or maybe a President Obama type, because at the beginning he was so inspirational. We're going to need somebody to get the people to take to the streets in a peaceful way. And
well, you can't do that if you can't. You got to keep your distance.
Well, so another reason why I'm feeling hopeless and why Rick Hasen is feeling hopeless, he said this now a number of times, is the combination, or I shouldn't say combination because it's more than two, the accumulation of these events, this Republican Supreme Court that rules every time for Republicans, according to Senator Whitehouse, 73 of 73, this Republican Supreme Court, Trump, Republican legislatures, and now the pandemic make it extraordinary. This is the worst time we could have had this pandemic. It's never
during an election year.
During an election year where Trump is running for re-election, because as much as I hated President Bush, which I did, as much as I didn't like President Reagan, it's not close. Trump is in a different category than that. It's going to be. Why are his polls going up, Pete? You tell me that. Why are his poll numbers going up?
I think because the people that pay attention to a certain media outlets are being told one thing, or they generally forget about the media outlets. They listen to what he is saying. I think that's the easiest way to understand why the Trump supporter feels the way they do about Trump, is that they just read his tweets and hear what he says, and he is able to accommodate their bias and tell them what they want to hear. What do you think it is?
Yeah, no, I think obviously that's a big part of the Fox presidential network is a big deal here. But I also think someone pointed out, that Americans, and there's nothing wrong with this, Americans rally for their leaders in times of crisis. We did rally for President Bush, after 9/11 for a while. And I don't think that's abnormal. That's what I'm saying. It's bad.
Well, it's abnormal if your leader's a shithead. Sorry.
Well, I
understand the desire.
But Bush was a shithead too.
Yeah, and he was a shithead at post 9/11, right? As he stood on that rubble and vowed revenge. Right. That was a shitty thing, revenge.
Yes. But we still rallied behind them.
Not the Saudis, not the people who hijacked those planes.
So my expert epidemiologist friend I've been talking about to various people who I get all my virus information from, lived in Brussels for about 20 years until just last year. And I always ask him, what do his friends in Europe think about it? Because he travels a lot. He lived in Brussels, but he traveled all over Europe. And he loved having political conversations with a certain group of people, educated, middle-class people. And he says to me all the time that people in Europe understand Bush versus Gore. They understand what Supreme Court did. They understand that maybe there was a need to get that election done with. And they don't hate us for that. What they hate us for is reelecting Bush.
Fair enough.
That's what they don't.
I remember that.
That's
night.
what they don't.
I remember that night.
That's what they don't understand. Yeah. He goes in. He creates this war with Iraq. That's a complete and total pretext. And all that. How can you reelect this guy? Well, the same thing. The same thing might happen again, and that's why Ari's losing his mind, and I'm so despondent.
Well, what do you make?
And
what do you make of yesterday the news was that the Supreme Court canceled all oral arguments for the rest of the term due to coronavirus.
Which is ironic given they made people vote Tuesday and die. I didn't
even think of that. Well, Rick Hasen, who you keep referencing, who is a scholar and an author, where is he? UCLA? No.
He's UC Irvine.
So he tweeted yesterday, I guess we were about to play What Will John Roberts Do in a Pandemic again? Yesterday was voting rights. Today is abortion. But I'm confused because I thought, what's going on? If all oral arguments are canceled, then aren't all decisions canceled too?
No, well, we don't know. So no one knows. The court doesn't know.
What do you mean? You can't have the court can't make a decision if it's not heard a case.
The court does. There's no requirement of oral argument, and the court it absolutely can do that.
I didn't realize that.
The court issues temporary, but not temporary, preliminary, but important rulings. All the decision yesterday, Pete, had no oral argument.
Right.
It was incredibly important. Right. It was incredibly. I'm sorry, not yesterday, Monday. It was incredibly important. What will John Roberts do is sadly the question which not only affects voting rights, but every other civil right. For example, as you and I have talked about, there is a huge case this term that affects so many people. I'm not even talking abortion, guns, or religion, which we could talk about. I'm not even talking abortion, guns, and religion. There is
then you're not you.
There's a huge case involving where the gays and lesbians and people who are transgendered are protected by the national employment discrimination law. And this is a huge case. And people keep saying Gorsuch is going to be the swing vote. Based on but I don't think so. I think Roberts is going to be the swing vote. So we're living in a country now where a very conservative, lifelong Republican, who although he was born in Indiana and raised in Indiana, is really a Beltway Republican, where he controls the destiny of the court, as opposed to what was the case from 2006 when Justice O'Connor resigned to 2018 when Justice Kennedy resigned, when the swing vote, the all-important vote, was a kind of Rockefeller Republican from California, who grew up in a very different environment. John Roberts is, conservative all the way down. Yeah. And the only thing the only thing that's going to stop him from voting in conservative ways is how he perceives that's going to be perceived. And I don't count on that very much.
When I confirmed the time for our conversation today, you texted me, yuppa doodle. And just now you said, gosh, and I'm wondering if you've been making new choices about language during the pandemic.
Well, my problem is, I'll tell you. So, yes, I did actually use the word yuppa doodle, but it's justified. No, let me tell you why, though. When I tell you why, you're going to say, oh, Eric, that makes sense.
Go ahead.
And this can be verified on Twitter. I was worried about my dog, Lucy, who had an emergency operation 2 weeks ago. And I knew when I was texting you that sometime today I was bringing her back into the vet to see if she was okay. And my mind was on that, so Yuppa Doodle just came to my mind. Now, do you feel bad about making fun of me now?
No, why Yuppa Doodle?
Doodle,
That's the breed of your dog?
No.
It's not even the breed of your dog, so no. I reject the entire premise of the suggestion that it was inspired by. It's not like you said Yuppa Labrador. I mean, you said Yuppa Doodle. This is crazy. It's just wild that you said Yuppa Doodle. I was like, what is he an infant that he's dealing with? Who the hell talks this way? Yuppa Doodle.
No, you know what it is?
I remember where I was. It was out in my backyard, and I read this text that said Yuppa Doodle. I'm like, why?
Do you remember where you were when Professor Eric Segall, the Kathleen Lawrence Ash Professor of Law at Georgia State, used the word Yuppa Doodle?
Yes, right by my above-ground pool, weed whacking.
I am so it's really interesting. I'm actually different subject, different time. I'm so proud of my kids right now and how they're handling this whole pandemic. And I'm so happy with my family. Like I cannot tell you how happy I am about that. Which is the most important thing. Yeah. At the same time, I am so despondent about what I do for a living.
I understand that. I understand that my advice is to as best you can stay within today, because when
it's my job.
I understand that. I understand that, but you know this better than I do, so I'm just giving you advice that you've given me, which is that you could get sick tomorrow.
I know. You're right. I know.
So don't worry about next week. Now help me with something before we end this.
Yeah.
This is a rare opportunity. So I'm looking at Twitter right now, and you're going to write the reply to what this person said to my earlier tweet. Again, my original tweet was voter ID requirements are the most obvious systemic racism. Those who support it will tell you need an ID to buy alcohol. Why shouldn't you need one to vote? 1, you show ID when you register to vote. 2, voter fraud isn't a problem. 3, voting is a right. Buying beer is not. This guy says, why? Do you think people are not capable of going through the process of getting the required ID? Segall, what a unique opportunity you get to write the response to this guy.
The response is that I would say to this person, how much exposure and contact do you have with the urban poor, the rural poor, and the elderly in both places? Because the reality is, and if you go to Ari Berman or Rick Hasen's articles and books, you will see that these people have a very hard time getting the proper identification. And to put those people through that for a non-existent problem that we have had court cases. I'll never forget, the Pennsylvania had a case challenging voter ID.
That's such a good answer that I'm actually going to quote the guy's tweet. Instead of just responding, I'm going to respond with a quote so everybody sees it. Nice.
Yeah. I mean, Pennsylvania did a whole trial on this, and there was not one. Pennsylvania was given a lot of time to say, I'm pretty sure it was Pennsylvania, not 100%, but 99%, saying, find this one example of in-person voter fraud. Nope, couldn't do it. Like, there were just no examples of in-person voter fraud. It doesn't exist. If this person was really worried about voter fraud, he would be looking at absentee voting, and he would definitely be looking at, for example, Georgia's voting machines, which are easily hackable. And, you know, even if we had the best in-person voter security in the galaxy, Georgia's voting machines, as I understand them, are so hackable that would be a much, you know, that's a real problem. And all those people who don't believe this, it's another example of how you shouldn't talk about what you don't know. Wow. And I'm guessing that person has no exposure.
My career.
No, because Pete, you don't talk about what you don't know. You ask the experts, then you learn.
That's right.
I'm not saying that because I love you. I'm saying that because it's true.
I say things sometimes. So.
The rural poor and the urban poor have, and especially the elderly, have a really hard time getting voter ID, full stop.
Well, how about this as the quote to that tweet? This is what I wrote. How much exposure and contact do you have with rural or urban poor or senior citizens in either community? Also, why make onerous and costly regulations or laws for a problem that doesn't exist?
Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you, Eric Segall. Second tweet. Wait, hold on. Oh. As a second tweet, you could say, there have been trials all over the country, and the Republican Party has failed to document or come up with any evidence that in-person voter fraud is a problem, despite having the country's best lawyers working day and night on the problem. How's that? Hello?
Yeah, I'm just writing it.
Okay. I wasn't sure what happened.
There have been trials all over the country, and Republicans have been unable to come up with any evidence.
Yes.
Despite
trying really hard.
All right, Betty.
Yeah. All right, my friend. I'm sorry to be the ranter today, but yesterday in Wisconsin was truly, you have to risk your life to vote. That's where we are.
He is on Twitter at eSpinSegall, and you should follow him there. You should get his books, The Supreme Court, The Supreme Myths, Why the Court is Not a Court and the Justices Are Not Judges. And we're scheduled to do a whole hour on that for this show, and we got to do that soon. And his newest book is Originalism as Faith, and he's a close personal friend of mine, and I couldn't be happier about that, especially during these difficult and strange times.
Me too.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Pete.
All right. And that is episode 79 of the Stand Up with Pete Dominick podcast. I hope you learned something. I certainly did. Thank you to all the listeners who joined me. Thank you to Rebecca Vallas and Noreen Springstead. Thank you to Eric Segall. And thank you, most importantly, to those of you who are paying a subscription for this podcast. I am doing daily, every day. I appreciate you listening. If you got a couple bucks to spare, it would be huge. As little as $5, as much as $1 billion, whatever you got to give, I really appreciate it. It goes a long way. I work for you. So, consider a paid subscription. Thank you very much for joining me, and I will talk to you tomorrow right here on Stand Up Count on it. Up by 4 a.m.